In a world so divided on issues that have a profound effect on humanity, how can we possibly help people to see that all human life is valuable?
And that all of these life issues are connected. It may feel overwhelming, but you are not alone.
Welcome to Consistent Life Network's Peace and Life Conversations podcast, where we will explore the journeys and thoughts of activists and everyday people of all generations who are working for the protection of all human life and promoting the consistent life ethic. Hello, welcome to the Consistent Life podcast produced by the Consistent Life Network. For those who aren't familiar with the Consistent Life Network, our mission is to uphold the consistent life ethic from conception to natural death through education and advocacy, rejecting the cycle of violence toward all life. In particular, we oppose war, abortion, the death penalty, euthanasia, racism, and poverty. Even though Consistent Life Network is a secular organization and we're not tied to any faith or, for that matter, political tradition, many people do come to their consistent life ethic by way of their faith tradition. Today, we're looking forward to what I think is going to be a deeply moving and inspiring testimony of one family's personal experience with the death penalty. And in part, we're going to explore how it's closely tied to their Christian faith. So I'm your co-host, Tony Masalonis. I'm a board member of the Consistent Life Network. I happen to have a doctorate in psychology from the Catholic University of America. I've been involved in activism on the life issues that we just mentioned for many years, and I've been on the board of the CLN since 2009. And we also have our co-host, Rosalyn, here.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rosalyn, your co-host. I'm currently an intern with the Consistent Life Network, and I'm a current student studying political science at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada. I'm very passionate about politics and activism, and I'll be joining the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform this summer to advocate for the unborn. So I'd like to welcome today's guest, Mr. Chris Brown. No, not that Chris Brown, as I'm sure he has told many people, but instead, Chris is an author who shares his powerful, consistent life testimony through Child of Grace books. His Christian faith anchors his activism, as his father was transformed by Jesus while incarcerated on death row. Sentenced to death, his legacy lives on through his son, who partners with a variety of organizations such as Journey of Hope, From Violence to Healing, Death Penalty Action, and Amnesty International to call for the abolishment of the death penalty.
Thanks, Rosalyn, and thanks, Chris, for joining us. And jump right in and ask just a couple questions. Our first question is, can you explain your father's story on death row and its impact on your family and why you think his sentence is disproportionate to the crime?
Yes, and thank you for that introduction, Rosalyn. It's great to be here with you and with the Consistent Life Network here. I'll tell you a little bit about my father's story, and then I'll kind of answer the question of how it affected the family, because there were different impacts, of course, with different family members and at different parts of this journey. So my father was sentenced to death when I was 6 years old. He went to Alabama's death row when I was 6 years old, and that was for the crime of murder. He and three other men had gone to do a robbery. One of them was just a driver, but he and two others went into a man's home with the intention to rob the man. It went badly, and they ended up killing this man. So, as many of these crimes are, this was a drug-related crime. They were all high when they went to do this crime. They all had a history of drug abuse. They all had a prior history of robberies and other criminal activity like that that sprang from their addictions. So you have three men committing this robbery that turns to a murder. And within a day or two, they were caught. Of course, these were not professional criminals or criminal masterminds or anything like that. So they were caught very quickly. And a lot of things happened throughout the trial. But in the end, my father was the only one who received a death sentence. And that's interesting on the face of it, but doubly so because he was actually the least culpable of the three. And if you were to read the trial transcripts, you would see that even in the court records, the prosecutors were very clear that there was one man they considered the ringleader that really was the one who caused this entire situation to take place. And he's still serving a life sentence at a prison in Alabama. There was a younger man who struck the death blow against this gentleman who was killed. And that man only did 10 years before he was released on parole. So my father certainly also guilty in this event and part of the crime and attacked the gentleman, but less culpable than the other two, was the only one to receive a death sentence and the only one executed in the end. She had a situation with this kind of great disparity in outcomes there, which is not uncommon in the death penalty. And those of you who follow death penalty cases at all, and I'm sure have seen that many times before. So they were all arrested. My father was in jail in Jefferson County, Alabama. And the time he sort of sobered up and started to understand the gravity of his situation and where he was and what the likely outcomes were, he was really ready to sort of listen to reason and listen to faith for the first time seriously. He had grown up in a Christian home. And in fact, I was raised by his parents. So this is not a case of a broken home or any of those things that you often hear about. In his case, he got in with a bad group of friends and escalated into addiction and drug abuse, and it just spiraled out of control over the course of several years. So he's in jail, he's sobered up, and he meets a GED teacher who it turns out goes to the church that he grew up in. And he asks her for a Bible. And in the end, he has a transformative experience with Jesus Christ and he becomes a Christian. And from there on, it is just radically transformed in the way that only the grace of God can do. So he was in jail, he gets saved, he goes to trial. They actually offered him a plea deal at one point, and his response was that he would not take a life sentence because he was not guilty of murder. He didn't go in with the intent to murder, and he was not the one who actually killed the person, nor was he the ringleader or the what they legally would call a dominating personality. So he refused that plea deal, and in the end, of course, was sentenced to death after the trial. So he went to a home and correctional facility in South Alabama. That's where Alabama's death row is housed. And he ended up being just a positive influence on everyone around him there. He preached to many, many others in the prison and outside the prison, through letters and other means. He was a tremendously positive influence on my life and just really lived out his faith for the 17 years that he was on death row at Holman Correctional Facility. So went through a number of things during that time. I think everyone's aware, at least in the US, this death penalty process is very protracted and you go through a lot of appeals and a lot of other legal wrangling and things that happen. We had an execution date set about a year before he was actually executed. We got within 8 hours of his execution on that day before he received a stay from the Supreme Court of the United States. And just illustrates the roller coaster that the family goes on, the emotional roller coaster. And there are other cases I can think of offhand where people had 5 or 6 execution dates. I know of one exoneree who was completely innocent of the crime who had 6 execution dates and was spared each time through different legal means and eventually was exonerated. So you have this system that puts everybody on this really damaging emotional roller coaster. So we get down to the end of his life and we went through a change in administration in the state. There was an election, a new governor from a different party, completely new system for requesting clemency and all of these legal matters that come up sort of at the last minute. We went through a clemency hearing that was, well, the way I usually put it is that it was a circus. It was just a mockery of justice and a mockery of our family. In the end, we realized that there was never any intention to do anything with that hearing. They had to say that they had held a hearing, and so they did, and made a mockery of all of us in the process of it, and for no benefit, for no gain. So we get down to the day of his execution, and the family spent the final day there praying, singing hymns, and sharing. And eventually, you get to the end of that day, and a corrections officer comes out and says, "It's time." And at that point, they walk him back to what they call the death cell, which is sort of where he stays for the days leading up to the execution and where he is before they actually take him to the execution chamber. So he and his spiritual advisor, who was a local pastor there, went back to the death cell. And then that was the last time that I saw him. And they spent a little bit of time, again, reading the Bible and praying and sort of talking about what heaven would be like, just preparing as much as they could for what would be taking place at that point, just a few minutes away. And again, corrections officers showed up to the death cell and they say, "It's time," meaning it's time to go to the execution chamber at that point. And what we know from the spiritual advisor, from that minister, is that my dad's last action was to share his faith with the corrections officers who were leading him to the execution chamber to kill him. And so the last thing he did was to share his faith with them and to have them hopefully know the peace that he knew at that time. And his last words were, "Forgive them." And as we're recording this podcast, have just completed Holy Week, and you think about Christ's last words on the cross and "Father, forgive them." And my dad sort of had that attitude too. He said, "Forgive them." He didn't want us to hold a grudge or have a bitterness toward the corrections officials or anybody else. And so I share that part of the story really to illustrate that that is the kind of man that the state of Alabama saw fit to kill on April the 24th, 2003. That a man of faith, a man of peace, a man whose last act was to share that faith and peace with the very people who were taking him to be killed. And so had this penalty, this ultimate and final penalty that in this case took the life of someone who was not a danger to anyone and was in fact a positive influence on everyone that he came across. So I also, since we're on video here, I can actually show this. I actually have his death certificate here, and I'm going to put it in front of the camera, and hopefully that will show up. But what you see there, yeah, it just came into focus. The cause of death on a death certificate for an execution is listed as homicide. I think it's important to make that point that there's no illusion about what this is. That this is a state sanctioned homicide, and it says it right on the official paperwork. So that's the story, the short version of his story. And you asked about how it impacted various family members. So there's a range of emotions there and a range of other things that we went through. My grandfather, his father, really suffered from depression from the time that this started until my grandfather passed away, which was about 3 years before my father was killed. And so it impacted him deeply. He was really not the same man that my father and my aunts and uncle had grown up with. My grandmother was also affected and showed it differently, and she just felt that deeply. That's the best way to put it, as any mother I think would in that situation. And they both struggled with this idea of, you know, what could have been done differently, what might we have done that would have changed something. And the fact was that they had done everything that anyone reasonably would have expected. Again, it was a good home. It's the home I grew up in. You know, my aunt and uncle came out of it just fine and did well. You know, everyone else was successful. So it wasn't a case of them doing something wrong necessarily. But that kind of thing sort of tortures the family members in these cases. You look at Supreme Court rulings and they have a saying that they say death is different. You've even seen that in recent rulings. They say the phrase death is different. And they acknowledge that the death penalty is something that's separate and it's different even from a life sentence or a life without parole sentence that others might receive for a similar crime. And so it does have that much more of a stigma and an impact on the family. And even myself, even in recent years, I think back to things like the clemency hearing and other things that happened with some of the politicians involved and some of the legal leaders involved. And I wonder, well, could I have said something different? Could I have done something different? It's one of those things that can hang with you and can really gnaw at you if you allow it to. So other points I'll make there, you know, the press was not very friendly to us. In one instance, a news crew showed up to my grandmother's church and sort of tried to ambush her the week that the execution was scheduled. And just this idea of trying to capture this elderly widow whose son is about to be killed on camera just for the spectacle, for the amusement of the masses, really is, I just think it speaks to the depravity that's in a lot of our culture, that there's this appetite for and this fascination with this sort of thing. My father left me an inheritance, so to speak. It was in a grocery bag. It was some Bibles and a concordance and a few other items like that. And I had not opened that bag yet before someone sent me a news article where a reporter listed everything that was in that bag for my inheritance. And you had to ask why was a reporter given access to that? How was that somehow part of the public interest that it was reported in the newspaper? So you have a number of things like that that happen, that you have this thing that becomes very public, and this thing where grief, actually the term for it is disenfranchised grief, where there's a sense that your grief is not valid, that you should not be allowed to grieve for this person who the state has deemed it necessary to kill. And then there are other cases where people express that. I encourage everyone who's listening and watching to Google a report from the Texas After Violence Project called Nobody to Talk to. They put it out in October 2019, and it does an excellent job of talking about the challenges that families of the condemned and of those who have been executed face trying to get counseling, trying to get mental health assistance and other things, and just how difficult that can be. So it really has a tremendous impact. I'll stop there. I could go on about how it affected aunts and uncles and other people because it really kind of touches everyone involved and sort of traumatizes in different ways everyone involved.
Thank you very much for that. At some point, maybe we'll have a follow-up interview and hear more about other family members who are affected because I mean, you really hit on it. And I've heard this from other people's accounts that it just touches so many more people than just the person who's executed it. We did want to go on to another question, which delves a little deeper into the consistency aspect of all this. How has the death penalty been politically weaponized in society? And what can we do to foster a true culture of life in politics in our world?
Well, I'll take the first question first. I could name a number of cases where I feel like it has been nothing but a political tool and something that's used for political gain and has really no bearing on justice or on any sense of deterrence or any other thing someone might try to argue. It really ultimately was just politics. Most recently, we had the spree of federal executions in the US. So you had the Trump administration on this really unprecedented execution spree, particularly with those after he had lost the election, where he continued to execute several more people during that lame duck period, which is something that had not been done since the 19th century. But with the first federal execution last summer, that I believe it was Daniel Lee, someone can check me on that. But with that first execution, first they did it illegally. It was on an expired death warrant because they actually went past midnight. So you had this thing where they were so bent on conducting this execution that they actually violated the Bureau of Prisons and Department of Justice regulations and procedure. And they did it without his counsel there. His counsel found out on Twitter that their client had been executed in the end while they were out of the facility. But within hours of that execution, I mean, literally just a couple of hours later, the Trump campaign sent out an email touting that execution and sort of trying to draw a contrast between he and his opponent at that time in the election. So it was very plainly a game of electoral politics for them and how to try and draw a contrast with their opponents. And even after his loss of the election, it really turned into this sort of tyrannical thing, in my opinion. Just he had the power and he wanted to use it, and so they went through with as many as they could. And I remember the last man who was executed. There was an interview with his sister, and it was just heartbreaking because she just kept saying, if we could just get 6 more days, if we could somehow get 6 days, it would be into the new administration and her brother's life would be saved. So, other examples, the state of Nebraska several years ago, the legislature, a Republican legislature, not only just passed abolition, but passed it with a veto-proof majority because they brought people in. They looked at all of the facts and they determined what anyone who looks at the facts determines that regardless of any moral issue with it, it doesn't work. It doesn't provide any positive benefit. It's innocent people being killed by it. It targets the most marginalized. So they realized that through their research, and so they voted accordingly, which I have to say is somewhat rare in American politics now. But then what happened afterward is where you saw a governor really stir up this kind of mass frenzy to bring back the death penalty by referendum. And so you had this huge effort, which again it was just political theater on his part that kind of whipped the state into a frenzy to bring it back. And the only people who lost were the people of the state of Nebraska, whose tax money and their politicians spent all of this time, money, and effort going back and forth on this thing, which they hardly used to begin with. And then in my home state of Alabama, we have a situation where judges are elected, and not just elected, but in partisan elections. And until recently, we also had judicial override in which a judge could override a jury sentencing decision. And in capital trials in the US, you have two phases. You have a guilt or innocence phase, and then you have a sentencing phase with actually a separate jury pool who decides whether they're going to recommend a life sentence or a penalty. And in Alabama, until just a couple of years ago, a jury could recommend life and a judge could override that and say, no, I'm doing a death sentence anyway. And a very large number of our people on death row here were actually sentenced to death that way. And the correlation that you immediately see there was that it happened during election years and it happened with judges who needed to appear tough on crime and be able to kind of use that in their campaigns in these partisan elections that they were going through every 4 years. And so, once again, it is absolutely a political weapon and had nothing to do with justice and nothing to do with actually trying to reduce crime in any way, everything to do with politics. So alternatives, the obvious alternative is the life sentence. Some people like a life sentence without parole. Personally, to me, that's just another death sentence. And because of my faith, I believe in redemption. So I believe in a life sentence and in a parole and pardons board who does their jobs and is able to determine and discern whether someone could be released back into society after a time. So that's the clear option is a life sentence, which is really better across the board. It's actually cheaper in terms of just dollars and cents and how the government works, and it eliminates a tremendous number of other problems. It's actually better for the families of the victims who don't then have to go through the entire appeals roller coaster alongside the families of the condemned. So you have something that really is better in every conceivable way than having this death sentence imposed. And in my opinion, I really think that the death penalty impacts all of society anyway in a negative way. I think you have some people call it the brutalization effect, where you sort of normalize violence as a response to any kind of problem, crime, or other violence, or whatever it is. And it really, as a society, we all end up with blood on our hands when the government kills in our name. So you have this sort of deleterious effect on our society just by having the death penalty at all, in my opinion.
Thank you.
Yeah, very good points there. You really hit on something, Chris, at the end there about normalizing violence. And I think all the forms of violence that consistent life ethic opposes essentially do the same thing. I mean, it puts blood on all our hands, whether it's the state doing it or what. Proponents of abortion talk about normalizing abortion, and there's even this out your abortion movement. They want people to be proud of it and for it to be a totally normal thing. War, of course. We support the troops, and what a lot of people say, of course, is that that has to mean you support everything that the troops are sent to do, regardless. War is normal, war is heroic, it's great, and it leads, I think, and it's been shown that it leads to violence, and even interpersonal violence, because violence becomes a normal way of solving problems. So true. Yeah. So I think maybe we have time for at least one more question. Rosalind, did you want to chime in
Yeah,
with one?
sure. So, our final question today is about receiving grace, specifically in your father's case, and then you personally through the journey of growing up with a father on death row. How has it changed your views on justice, especially to your critics who say that abolishing the death penalty denies justice to the victims, their families, and creates a culture of weakness in society?
That's a great question. I think I'm going to take the second part first. When someone says that it weakens society or it denies justice, to me that's entirely false. I think when we think about justice, we think about repairing what was broken or trying to fulfill what was broken. Killing another person does not bring back a person who was killed. And despite what prosecutors try and sell people on in terms of closure and that sort of thing for the victim's family, that's a lie. That they're being sold a bill of goods. Killing another person only creates more victims. It does not serve justice. It does not bring somebody back. It does not add anything on balance to society. So when you think about that in terms of Christianity, we serve a Lord who was executed. Our Savior was wrongly executed by a Roman government who really didn't care about, in this case, a marginalized group of people under the empire. And there are very strong parallels there to the way the death penalty is applied in the US. So we have a Savior who was executed, further than that, you have in the Gospel of John, the one instance where Jesus was faced with the religious leaders saying a woman should be stoned, and the law, the Mosaic law said, yes, that person should be stoned for she was caught in the very act. And we saw what Jesus's reaction to that was. His reaction was not to excuse what she did. He said, "Go and sin no more." But he did show mercy to her. And from that account, it doesn't seem like there was even a hint that he would have gone through with a death sentence for her. In fact, he said, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone." So you get into this question, it's something that Brian Stevenson of the Equal Justice Initiative brings up as well. It's not so much a question of whether someone deserves to die, it's a question of whether we as a society deserve to kill. And to me, the answer to that is plainly no, not just because there are so many errors in the justice system, but just from that moral standpoint that we were discussing a moment ago, that it really has a negative impact on all of us when violence is the acceptable answer to this. So to carry that even further, we have Jesus dying on the cross for all of us in the Christian view. And to me, if you say that anyone should be killed by the government, that anyone who has been rendered defenseless, who's sitting in a cell defenseless, needs to be dragged out of that cell and killed by the government and is beyond redemption, that is to deny the very work of Christ on the cross. That is, in my opinion, to literally look at our Savior and say, get back up on the cross, or what you did the first time was not enough. It was not enough for that person. It wasn't enough for this worst of the worst person that we have that we think is beyond redemption. And to me, that's untenable. There's no way, there's nobody, there's no terrible crime or historical wrong you could bring up where I would say, no, Jesus's blood was not enough to cover that person, that person is beyond redemption. As a Christian, I just can't say that about anyone, no matter what they've done. And to bring out another Brian Stevenson quote, everyone is more than the worst thing that they ever did. So any individual, no matter how horrific a crime they committed, is more than that crime. And through the redemptive grace of Jesus Christ, they can be so much more and be such a positive influence. And so, as my friends at Death Penalty Action say, we remember the victims, but not with more killing.
Yeah, thank you. I think it takes great courage to show compassion, to give people a chance to be redeemed, because it's a very basic instinct for people to want to, when they're hurt, rightfully take out their anger, especially on those who hurt them. And I'm not denying the horrible acts of murder, of rape, of violence committed by the perpetrators. They need justice for the victims. But what is society saying when we allow our government to kill to justify those actions? And how much power I think the government has should concern everyone, regardless of your political beliefs, conservative or progressive, because fundamentally, the right to life is inherent, and the government should not have the ability to take that away.
I agree. And I believe that people who say they want small government are often the ones who seem to support the death penalty in the US. And to me, those things are mutually exclusive. There is no bigger government than saying that the government can kill its own citizens who have been rendered defenseless already. So I don't believe that any government should have that ability. And you carry that even further, you have a lot of people who, to me, have this inherently contradictory stance, and they'll say they don't trust the government to do anything. They don't trust the government to deliver the mail, but they'll turn around and trust the very same government with the life and death of its citizens. Well, it's the same government. If you don't trust them to deliver the mail, how could you possibly trust them to carry out the ultimate sentence? And you start looking at the numbers of people exonerated, the number of times that they've gotten it wrong. And the latest numbers, I think there's one exoneration now for every 8 executions. So you imagine that more than 10% of airplanes fell out of the sky when they flew. We would never accept that. We would never accept that error rate and anything else that has to do with life and death. But a lot of society is willing to totally overlook it for the justice system. And to me, that just does not make any sense. You can't make that work logically, claiming small government and also claiming to allow the government to have this power.
Yeah. Thank you for pointing out those fallacies because I think there's a lot of inconsistencies in politics and rhetoric, which is why the consistent life ethic is quite unique because it's very, as the name says, consistent across the board. We start with the idea that life starts at conception as an inherently valuable from conception to the point of natural death. And it's a straight line. At no point should that life be taken away, even if people do horrible, egregious actions like take a life of another person, not justifying that action, but looking at society and saying that society and government does not have the right to kill, which is fundamentally the question. Should our government be able to kill its own people? And I hope that this podcast really asks everyone to examine those questions. So, I'd like to thank our guest, Mr. Chris Brown,
It's great to
for
be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Chris. And to our listeners and or viewers, if you're interested in reading Chris Brown's books, they're available for purchase on CTP Child of Grace Books. That's all one word, and it'll be on the viewable version of the podcast. So, but Child of Grace Books, all one word.com. If you want to learn more about the Consistent Life Network, you can visit our website. It's Consistent Life Network, all one word.org. You can also find us on social media. We're on Twitter at Consistent Life, one word. We're on Facebook. Again, Consistent Life is our handle there. On Instagram, we're Consistent Life Net, N-E-T. We're out there. Please join us again next time for another informative episode. And thank you to my co-host and our wonderful guest again for being with us.
thank you. Have a great night. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye, all. Peace. Thanks for joining the Consistent Life Network's Peace and Life Conversations podcast. All links and organizations mentioned in our episodes are linked in the description box. For more information, visit us at consistentlifenetwork.org. We'll see you next time.